Hello everyone, Maddie here, and welcome to my channel, and welcome to a different kind of video. So, I've been wanting to do this kind of a video for a little while now, ever since I started my YouTube channel. And basically what I want to do is kind of do a book review of a Stephen King book. So, I don't want to just do Stephen King books when I do these. I want to do book reviews for any book that I found really interesting or really exciting to work with. And for this book review, I'm going to be reviewing Stephen King's Lisey's story. Now, the reason why I chose this book to be my first book is because, one, I love Stephen King if you don't know this already, but also I wanted to watch the TV show that's on Apple Plus TV. And I thought that it'd be a really great opportunity to be able to really dive deep into the story of Lisey's story before I watch the show. So, throughout this video, you're going to be hearing my thoughts about some key scenes throughout the story, as well as some lines that I thought were really interesting, and I'll try to go into as much detail as I can about why I thought that those lines were interesting and why I thought those points were interesting. And then if you want to go ahead and check my other video that will be uploaded here shortly about the actual show that's on Apple Plus TV and the comparisons between that and the book, please check out that video once that is uploaded. I'll show a picture of the copy that I'm using on the screen right now, and that version is about 650 pages long, so if you have that version, please follow along. But otherwise, this is just to kind of give you an idea of where in the story these things that I'm talking about fall. So on page 26, I actually had marked a really interesting passage. That this is going to be a quote that I thought was very interesting. It says, "When it was done and you went to sleep, I lay awake and listened to the clock on your nightstand and the wind outside, and understood that I was really home, that in bed with you was home, and something that had been getting close in the dark was suddenly gone. It could not stay. It had been banished. It knew how to come back. I was sure of that. But it could not stay, and I could really go to sleep. My heart cracked with gratitude. I think it was the first gratitude I've ever really known. I lay there beside you, and the tears rolled down the sides of my face and onto the pillow. I loved you then, and I love you now, and I have loved you every second in between. I don't care if you understand me. Understanding is vastly overrated, but nobody ever gets enough safety. I've never forgotten how safe I felt with that thing gone out of the darkness." I thought that that quote was really interesting because it kind of shows right away in the beginning of the story that Lisey's vulnerable and that she really does miss her husband Scott. And it kind of shows that she could still feel his presence there and that she still feels safety knowing that he was a part of her life and that he, in a way, is still with her. Okay, so on page 48, so a little bit later on, I have another quote that I thought was interesting. "But if every book is a little light in that darkness, and so I believe, so I must believe, corny or not, for I write the damn things, don't I? Then every library is a grand old ever-burning bonfire, around which 10,000 people come to stand and warm themselves every day and night." So I thought that was really interesting because it kind of just shows, and this is Scott saying this, that he kind of views books as not only like a way for people to be able to escape, but also to be able to warm themselves, to feel comforted, to feel like they're a part of this world and that he writes about, and that it's not just about people escaping or people enjoying what you write about, but it's also about the actual act of feeling that presence of the book, feeling the world that it takes place in, and really diving into it and kind of surviving off of it because humans can't survive without heat. So in a sense, Scott is saying that humans can't survive without books, without the written word. So it took me a little while to find another marker that I thought was interesting, and I think from here on it actually is marked quite a bit more in the story. I actually was starting to get more and more into marking the stories. I found another quote here. It says, "She was thinking that if darkness had loved Scott, why then that was true love, wasn't it? For he had loved it as well, had danced with it across the ballroom of years until it had finally danced him away." So obviously that is kind of giving a personification to darkness and how Lisey kind of realized that Scott and darkness went hand in hand, and that there were a lot of dark moments in his life, and that without those dark moments, Scott wouldn't be the person that he is today, and that she kind of recognizes that and says, "Okay, I understand, and I'm okay with the darkness that I see in him, and I hope that it doesn't necessarily consume him, but that it continues to make him the person that she loves." And I thought that was really interesting. That was on page 135. Okay, so I have my first marking of a plot point that I thought was really interesting. It is on page 146. "It's a bull, Lisey," he shouts as the light springs on, and could he have planned it better if he had stage managed it? She thinks not. In his voice she hears mad jubilant relief, as if he has fixed everything, and not just any bull, it's a blood bull. So this is the first time, really, that they describe bulls, and bull is a made-up word, but it's a word that Scott and his family use to kind of describe like a treasure hunt of a sort. And a blood bool is when you actually draw blood when you cut yourself in order to kind of show not only the pain that you're going through like in an outward fashion, but also to kind of release the tension and release the pain and suffering that you're going through to kind of center yourself again. And it's interesting because he describes this to Lisey for, I believe, the first time, in that she realizes that it's not just a treasure hunt that she's going to be going on, but that it's also a pretty important treasure hunt. And that's why he describes it as a blood bool. Okay, so on page 163, I have another plot marker, and it says, "Because these wounds, while not exactly scratches, are far from as serious as she thought. They've not only clotted over, they've started scabbing over. If she'd taken him to the dairy home ER, they probably would have told her to get lost. All the Landons are fast healers. We had to be." So this is when she kind of realizes that this phrase that Scott Landon has told her several times, that the Landons are fast healers, she kind of realizes that it's true and that it wasn't just a phrase, that it actually did mean something. And so that at this point in the story, she is realizing that, he's in really bad condition with his hands because he just punched through the greenhouse because he was so upset about the fact that she basically told him that she didn't appreciate him being late from, seeing her for her date, and that there were a lot of other things that were upsetting her. She kind of like let them loose all at once, and then he got so upset that he basically punched through a green glass window, and it cut up his hands pretty badly. And she's all freaking out, saying that she needs to take him to the ER and all that. But then he's like, "Nope, it's fine. We're fast healers. It'll close up." And her seeing the next day that it's already started to clot over, that it's already a week or two in the process of healing, even though it's only been a night, it kind of proves that, wow, maybe there is something to it, and maybe there's something deeper into that meaning. So another plot point, and this one actually has been seen quite a bit throughout the story, is kind of a narrative way of how he describes some of the thoughts that Lisey has. So on page 188, and this has happened quite a bit in the past, but it's going to happen from here out quite a bit more. It describes as what the nurse had said on the day after Scott had been shot, for instance, or, in quotations, "Hush, do hush." What had happened in parentheses, "hush," exclamation mark, the winter of 1996, parentheses, "you hush now," all caps, exclamation mark. And for a blue-eyed wonder that voice did, but she sensed it watching, listening, as she was afraid. So that's just kind of describing how there's this internal monologue between Lisey and herself, basically saying that whenever she was thinking about her past, whenever she was thinking about stuff that made her really uncomfortable, that was really dark, that her internal monologue was kind of being like, "Hey, you need to stop thinking about this now. If you start going down this rabbit hole, you're going to be in pain." And it's interesting because it's like the first real time that you start to experience that monologue and how almost kind of debilitating it is for Lisey. But then as you go throughout the story, you kind of realize, oh wait, maybe that voice had a point, but maybe you have to kind of stop listening to those kind of voices, because otherwise it's going to keep you in the past and keep you in the dark. Okay, so I have another plot point on page 216. It's right before the next section, which is called Lisey and the Professor. This is what it gets you. The quote is, "The darkest shape grew fur and ears, and a nose that probably would have been pink in daylight. There was no mistaking the eyes, even dulled in death. Their shape was distinctive. There was a dead cat in her mailbox." So this is when Lisey discovers a dead cat that's been stuffed in the very back of her mailbox, and she finds out a little bit later that it was Dooley, Jim Dooley, or the one that was threatening her over the phone for the professor, so that she could give the professor her the manuscripts from Scott that she has been holding on to, or at least that they believe she's holding on to. And so they kind of threaten her to say that, hey, he's serious and that, she really does need to give him these manuscripts. He has killed a cat that he believes is her cat, to kind of prove that, like, hey, he's serious, that he's going to show pain. He kills the cat, puts it in her mailbox, and she sees this, and it's really, it's gory, like she doesn't necessarily like that, and she has to clean it up now. But it also kind of proves that, like, he doesn't really know much about her because it's not actually her cat. And I think it's interesting because this is actually a reference to like Pet Sematary, and that, the dead cats and killing of animals is definitely a plot point that you see quite a bit in Stephen King's writing. Okay, so I have another plot point marked on page 254. It says, Lisey flipped back and forth between Hollyhocks and Fourth Station, look under the bed. She thought that if she put the two writing samples in front of Darla and Canty, they would, without hesitation, identify the former as Amanda's work and the later as Scott's. So it's interesting because and at this point she's looking through one of the journals that Amanda had left at the house that had all of these markings for the different photos that Scott and Lisey are in from past newspaper clippings and such. She finds these two different kind of notes within one of the journal. One says Hollyhocks, and the other one says Fourth Station, look under the bed. And she realizes that they are written in a completely different format. One of them is definitely Amanda's writing, the other one is Scott's. And it's interesting because she knows that Amanda was the one that had written in these journals, but the fact that Scott's handwriting was there and that it was what she figures out is like a bool is another hint. She quickly kind of jumps on that and kind of realizes that, wow, maybe Scott actually is kind of influencing her, that there is something to this bool hunt that he's put her on. Okay, so the next one is actually a quote, so it's been a little while since I've told a quote. It's on page 289, and it says, I'll tell you a story, he says, just one story, and let it stand for all the stories of a certain man's childhood, because stories are what I do. He looks at the rising cigarette smoke. I net them from a pool. I've told you about the pool, right? So Sky is kind of explaining to Lisey that that he has a lot of stories, but that he only wants to tell one story, and it's the important one about his childhood for that moment. And it's interesting because he describes it as a pool, as if he's taking these stories that he comes up with not only from his childhood, but also for his novels, and that there is like this giant pool that he kind of visualizes and takes those plot points, take those memories from this pool to be able to write into a story to be able to publish. And you could definitely tell that, in my opinion at least, a lot of writers kind of visualize something like a pool or like a library or like some form of personification or metaphor of where they're getting their ideas from. And at this point you're kind of wondering, like, is Scott explaining what he visualizes when he's coming up with plots, or is this actually some sort of pool that he's taking these memories from? That quote is also really important in that he's actually going to be telling her about his childhood, and Lisey's kind of made it a point in this story that she doesn't really know much about Scott and Scott's childhood and Scott's family, so it's interesting that he's finally decided that it's about time that he tells her something. Okay, so this next one is going to be a plot point. It's on page 296, and it says, Scott, did your crazy daddy understand he was abusing a couple of smucking child prodigies? So this one's short because I found a couple different things that were really interesting with this. First off, she uses the word smucking, and she does this quite a bit. It's apparently a Scottism, like something that Scott said a lot in his family. It seems as though they don't really like to swear, that there's a lot of childish annotations that he says and that his family says instead of like swearing, or instead of like using proper grammar. They use a lot of like childish phrases and a lot of like childish words instead of like what they would consider adult words. And so instead of fucking, they say smucking, and there's a couple others that they use throughout the story. But the more important thing is the fact that Lisey kind of figures out, and also is like kind of making sure with Scott, that his dad, or they say his daddy, was actually pretty abusive, and that he probably wasn't as crazy as Scott is making him seem, and that, or at least that he isn't believing what his dad actually was believing, and that maybe he was actually just abusing his kids, and that he was trying to find an excuse, or Scott was trying to find an excuse to give a reason for why his dad was, hurting them like this. Okay, so I have another plot point on page 305, and it says, I put a pickaxe in his head while he was sleeping, and then dumped him down the old dry well. It was in March, during the bad sleet storm. I drug him outside by the feet. I tried to take him where Paul was buried, but I can't. I tried, and I tried, but Lisey, he won't go. So there's a few things. Again, you kind of see the like progression of him being more childish and saying stuff like trite and Barrett and cunt. Like he can't really say words properly because he's kind of regressing back into his childhood. You also see something very important, and you actually do get this reference later on in the story, is that he had killed his father with a pickaxe, and it is actually described a lot farther in the story on like why he did that. You also realize that Paul, his brother, who you didn't even know was a person in his family, also was killed and also was buried somewhere nearby there. Okay, so I have a quote from page 341, and it says, And when they go there, they never go together, and she is afraid that is also a preview of death, a place where there may be dreams but never love. Never home, never a hand to hold yours, when squadrons of birds flock across the burnt orange sun at the close of the day. So in this quote, it's kind of describing that, like, sometimes you have to go to your safe place, to like even just a destination by yourself. That sometimes you have to do things by yourself, and that although it would be nice and helpful and safe to be able to go with other people, you don't necessarily do that because sometimes you have to do things by yourself. And she kind of uses this as like, to describe stuff like a flock of birds, or just in general, like that she needs to figure this stuff out herself and that there's no one really there to help her. Okay, so on page 357, I have another plot point. It says, mercy killing. Yeah, that's what my daddy did to Paul. In the room beyond the bed and furniture, once more shivers toward visibility, then once more retreats into shadow. So, that was a quick quote, and just saying that, like, yes, Paul, his brother, was killed by his dad, and you don't really understand why. Okay, I have a quote on page 366. It's actually a short section or a short chapter within this section, and it says, the arguments against insanity fall through with a soft, shiring sound. These are the sounds of dead voices on dead records, floating down the broken shaft of memory. When I turn to you to ask if you remember, when I turn to you in our bed. Now, this is actually something that Scott had written, I believe, and it's kind of just, it's a phrase that Lisey goes back to quite a bit in this section and also in the future sections of the story. Specifically, the arguments against insanity fall through with a soft, shiring sound. And it's kind of just describing that, like, things that you might consider to be insane could actually be very real, could actually be very clear thoughts. And so it kind of gives you as the reader the interpretation of all these things that you don't understand, that you don't think are real, might actually be real, and that you need to like look deeper into it and kind of figure out why it makes sense. And I also wanted to just quickly mention that at the end of this section, it doesn't end on a period or end on a like final thought for that sentence. It just melds into the next section, and this happens a lot in the story. It kind of shows that Lisey's like remembering all these memories and that she's going back into the present, and it's all kind of flowing together, that there really is no breaks necessarily. It's all just a train of thought. It's like you think of one memory and then it kind of blends into another and then another, and then you're back in the present because something happens in the present. And this happens a lot in the story, and I think that that's really interesting of a narrative kind of flow of like how she exactly is going through these memories, and how like time in the real world isn't going that fast, but that she's living through days of memories, and to kind of try to remember like why she needs to know these things. Okay, I have another plot point on page 390. It says, here the smell is intense, not the odor of shit or even hair and skin, but rather of fur and pelt. The thing has a penis that is bigger than Paul's was. Paul's peach fuzzy groin has thatched in with the thing's coarse, dense pubic hair, and the feet at the end of Paul's legs. Those legs are the only things that still look the same, have a queerly turned-in look, as if the bones in his ankles are warping. Boards left out in the rain, Scott thinks. It's not quite nonsense. So in this section, it kind of is showing how Paul has been going through what they call the bad gunky, or this like kind of insane appeal to him, and that he's not really him anymore. And it's actually showing like a physical change in his body, and that he's kind of turning into this weird devil beast. And it's not only showing that like he's not really human anymore, but it's also showing that he has this animalistic like sexual feel to him now. Like like describing stuff like the pubic hair and the penis is kind of showing that like, hey, he's not only animalistic now, but he's like really far gone. He is not human anymore. They actually do describe later in it that he jerks off in it, and that it's like fully erect at times. Like it's a very descriptive and kind of nasty way of just describing how animalistic Paul is, and that he's not really Paul anymore. Okay, on page 420, I have another plot point. It says, this happens to be about me. It's beautiful here. She looks around and she shivers. It's too beautiful. If I spend too much time here, or even too much time thinking about it, I think the beauty would drive me insane. So if our time is short for once in your smucking life, you be short. Tell me how you buried him. So Lisey's kind of realizing that the place that Scott has brought her to, this place that is kind of like his safe haven, that is the place that he goes to when he's trying to escape from his family or try to come up with interesting plots for his books. She realized that it's too beautiful, that if she stayed there, she would be stuck, that she would be catatonic in the real world. And so she's kind of realizing that, hey, they need to like pick it up. They need to figure out exactly why she's there, why Scott brought her there, and also the facts that Paul's obviously dead at this point, and Scott's kind of given the impression that Paul's body is actually buried in this imagination world. Okay, on page 430, I have a quote. It says, "It's a secret," Lisey thought, "and it should be, because who would ever want to get close to another person if they knew how hard the letting go part was? In your heart, they only die a little at a time, don't they? Like a plant when you go away on a trip and forget to ask a neighbor to poke in once in a while with the old watering can, and it's so sad." So the sentence kind of breaks off there, and it's kind of just describing that it's hard to get close to someone and then to let them go, and you like nourish this person, you nourish your feelings for the person, you nourish memories that you have with that person, but then when they're gone or when you have to step away from it, you kind of realize that maybe you didn't put in as much effort as you should have. Maybe you didn't make the plans, make the proper steps to be able to take care of it farther and to be able to keep it so that when you return to it, it's just the way you left it. And she uses a plant analogy in that, like, if you go on vacation and you don't tell someone to take care of it, after a week when you come back, it's dying or it's dead. And it's the same thing with memories or with a person. If you don't keep them in your thoughts, if you don't keep them the way they are, and take the proper steps to be able to take care of them, then they're not going to be there anymore when you come back, or they're going to be perverted in a different way that's not necessarily the way you want them to be, and you have to throw them out and not necessarily think about them anymore. On page 439, I have a plot point. Maybe because some things are special, the way Scott is special, and she is a version of Lisey Landons still back in the house on Sugartop Hill. She thinks not. So this is kind of describing that she realizes when she goes back to this world that Scott has created, this imagination world, she wonders if her body is still in the real world, if Scott's body is still in the real world. And she kind of thinks that maybe not, maybe they actually disappear in the real world, because there have been moments when she had went into a room, like in the bathroom or in the hospital, when Scott was in the hospital, and he wasn't there. He was gone. But then, like, another moment when she turned around, or when she had turned a sink or whatever, all of a sudden he's there, just like he had been there the entire time. And so she kind of makes that realization that when they go into this imagination world, they actually physically go into the world, that they do disappear from the real world, and that kind of gives it a bit more weight of the world. It's not just their mind being in there, that they actually are physically there, and that it could be considered a trap or an escape, depending on how you look at it. On page 464, I have another plot point. The breast Julie had operated on with such lunatic absorption was marked with an ugly scarlet ditch that circled up from beneath her armpit before petering out above her ribcage. It looked like a fairly bad cut that might have happened 2 or 3 weeks ago and was now healing well. So, at this point, Jim Dooley had come to her house and had basically hurt her with a can opener, and it kind of went that next step from hurting her, what he thought was her cat, to actually hurting her, and to kind of give her one last chance to be able to give the professor the manuscripts, even though Lisey knows that the manuscripts will never be able to go to the professor, that Jim Dooley at this point is actually insane. And so after he had hurt her, she had gone back to this world that Scott had imagined and drank from the pool. And she realized the next day that it had healed more than it should have. And it's kind of giving her this vision of, or this understanding of, okay, so now I understand why Scott had healed so quickly, why he had said that Paul had healed, or why he had healed when he was a child so quickly, why they consider the Landons fast healers. It's not because of them, it's because of the pool. It's because of this imagination world that Scott goes to, that his family goes to, that now she has gone to, and it has this rejuvenating aspects to it, but it's a question of whether, like, why it does that and what the cost would be. On page 482, I have another plot point. It says, and as she felt the second mouthful of water she had drunk from the pool flow from her mouth to her sister's, Lisey saw the pool with a perfect daytime clarity that beggared her previous efforts at concentration and visualization, fierce and driven though they had been. So it's interesting because at this point, she kind of realized why she had taken 2 sips from the pool instead of just 1. And it wasn't necessarily just for her, but it was also for her sister. It was to be able to get her sister out from this catatonic state that she was in. Because she realizes that Scott had left the pool, had left those hints to bring her to her sister to also go to the pool to be able to save her sister, because he has seen in the past and has helped her in the past get out of that catatonic state. And you imagine at this point in the same way, and that he brought the pool to her to like heal her and to kind of bring her back to herself. And now Lisey is the person that's doing that in place of Scott. On page 499, I have a quote. I think most kids have a place they go to when they're scared or lonely or just plain bored. They call it Neverland or the Shire, Booyah Moon if they've got big imaginations, and make it up for themselves. Most of them forget. The talented few, like Scott, harness their dreams and turn them into horses. So, again, this is kind of describing that there is this magical world that Scott has created that is healing people, that is bringing them back, that is creating these beautiful plots for his stories, but that it's not necessarily unique. It's not just his world. Other people have also found this world and have called it different things and have seen different settings for this world, like Neverland. And he calls it Booyah Moon, in that he's a lot more detailed and that he's a lot more special and that he can see these things in a more clear and different look, but that it is all just one place, that it is this other world that's tied with the real world, and that you can go to it physically, but that it is just an imagination world. On page 539, I have another quote. It says, if you were brave, if you were persevered, if it brought you to a treasure, and the treasure was never the money you got for the book. The treasure was the book. Lisey supposed the Roger Dashmiel of the world didn't believe it, and that Joseph Woodbodies thought it had to be something grander, more exalted. But Lisey had lived with him, and she believed it. Writing a book was a bull hunt. So it's interesting because at this point, you kind of see that Scott views writing books not for the money, not for the fame, but just for the fact that he's writing these stories, that he's giving people appreciation for these stories, and that there are other people like the professor and like just there are people in the world that kind of see it as only money or as only fame, and that's why they're so adamant to get his manuscripts that he's written but never publish. But in fact, it's not that. It's that books are treasures in themselves. And I personally have always thought this myself, that I don't necessarily want to make money from writing, but that I want people to appreciate the worlds that I come up with. And Scott Landon obviously has shown that as well. And Lisey also describes it as a bull hunt, and that it very much is kind of a treasure hunt. You don't necessarily know what you're going to write, and sometimes it's a matter of like taking them step at a time and to see the hints and see the clues and to kind of figure out how the ending is going to progress. On page 549, there's another plot point. The last thing Scott said to Maid after the reading and just before the reception began was, call my wife, would you? Tell her she may have to fly out here. Tell her I may have eaten the wrong thing after sunset. It's kind of a joke between us. So I didn't know this at the time, but that actually is kind of a, even though we're towards the end of the story at this point, it was something that I didn't understand until a little later even. And it's the fact that he is dying at this point. He is actually, like, this is the point where you kind of realize how he died, because you know from the very beginning of the book that he's dead, but this is the actual scene where he is dying, and he explains that he ate something that he wasn't supposed to, and that his wife would understand. And in actuality, Lisey doesn't understand. She doesn't understand until much later, just like the reader. And the reader's kind of figuring this stuff out as Lisey's remembering it. So what he's describing as he ate something that he wasn't supposed to is that he actually had eaten something at the Booyah Moon that he shouldn't have, that you should only ever drink from the pool during the day. But he, in a what you realize later on is like desperation in a way to try and heal himself because he is dying. He eats something inside Booyah Moon that he's not supposed to, and it was dark, and he didn't know that it was sunset, that the light was leaving, and so it temporarily healed him for just a moment, but then it had hurt him to the point where now he is actually dying. On page 554, there's another plot point. Then I'll go, just help me. But he shakes his head. Lying across the path to the pool, it. So it was very short, but the reason why I chose that as a plot point is because, one, I just like the reference to it. I know he didn't necessarily want to reference the, killer clown, it, but I just thought that that was interesting that he said it like that. But he also said it because Scott is warning Lisey when Lisey's saying that she will take him to the pool to heal him. He's saying that no, it's too dangerous because the long boy, this creature that is going to kill him, is in the path, and that he doesn't want Lisey to also be trapped by this long boy. Okay, on page 557, I have a quote, and it's actually a pretty long one because I thought it was very interesting. It said, "Had his death been on a flower that he had picked up and smelled, or a bug that had slipped its zipper under his skin as the sun went down red in its house of thunder? Did he get it on a quick visit to Booyah Moon a week or a month before his final reading in Kentucky, or had it been waiting for decades, ticking like a clock? It might have been a single grain of dirt that got under one fingernail while he was digging his brother's grave. Just a single bad bug that lay asleep as the years passed, finally waking up at his computer one day when a reluctant word finally came to him and he snapped his fingers in satisfaction. Maybe, terrible thought, but who knew?" So I found that really interesting because she's trying to figure out when he had started to go insane, when this affliction that seemed to have possessed his brother Paul and his father had also started to possess Scott. And she's trying to come up with a excuse for a reason for why this might have happened. Maybe it was a bug in the world. Maybe it was the dirt from when he was digging the grave for his brother in Booyah Moon. Maybe it was nothing even from that, but from his family themselves. And she's just trying to come up with some excuse to try to come up for some reason for why this might have happened, when in reality it was the long boy. On page 567, there's another plot point. She used her tongue to force his lips open, kissed harder, and so passed on her second sip of pool. She felt the sweetness go. The world she knew wavered and then began to go with it. It happened fast. So at this point, she has realized that she took 2 sips for a reason, not just for herself and not just for her sister, but to also transport Jim Dooley to this other world to be able to trap him in it. And so she forces this water, same as she did with Amanda, into his mouth to be able to really get that link into the other world that she needed. Okay, I have a plot point on page 577. Then the flat of the blade connected with Jim Dooley's onrushing face, making not a crunch, the sound that she remembered from Nashville, but of kind of muffled gong-gonging. So at this point, she has hit Jim Dooley with the shovel that she had hit the attacker way back when Scott did the shoveling for the library in Nashville, and that is when he had been attacked and shot in the lung. She did the same thing to that guy as she did to Jim Dooley, and smacking him upside the face and cutting him on his face, and I think actually like ripping off his nose for the most part. And it's interesting that there's like that connection to her being able to protect her, to protect Scott basically, even though Scott isn't necessarily there anymore. And then on the same page there is a quote that I thought was interesting. "Then and suddenly it's there, Scott's long boy, and she understands that once you have seen the long boy, past and future become only dreams. Once you have seen the long boy, there is only, oh dear Jesus, there is only a single moment of now drawn out like an agonizing note that never ends." And this is when she really realizes that the reason why Scott's got insane, the reason why, well, him not being insane, but him getting sick, the reason why his brother Paul went insane, his father went insane, is because of the long boy. Because once you see the long boy, once it gets your scent, you're stuck, that if you let him grab you, then you will go insane, that you will go into a murderous rage. And now that she's seen the long boy for herself, now she's worried that that's going to happen to her. And she finally like understands all of that. On page 584, I have a plot point. It had kept her at arm's length for 2 long years, but she thought the major chore which had needed doing in here was now done. She and Amanda had cleansed Scott's ghost away, kindly, and time would tell, but she was almost positive, completely. So she had returned back to the real world, and she had cleaned out his office space, had taken away all of the computers and all of the books, like the entire office, except for a carpet that was bloodstained, is completely empty. And she kind of feels like not only is the office empty finally after 2 years, but also all those memories that she had been kind of keeping in the dark, keeping behind the purple, are finally cleared away, that she remembers everything and doesn't feel that sense of that she has to keep it a secret from herself, that she has to keep it away from herself. She finally can go back and look back at those memories and kind of feel a sense of happiness and like satisfaction, the fact that she doesn't feel this negative connotation to them anymore. On page 603, there is another plot point, because when she opened her eyes to see where the remote was, she was lying not on the couch but on the hill of Lupin in Booyah Moon. So that was a short little section just because I just wanted to describe how, or it kind of explains how now that she's gone to Booyah Moon and now that she completely understands what this place is and like what the context is with Scott, she now seems to be kind of going back and forth between the reality and this imagination world without her knowing it, and that it's kind of unsafe for her now because she doesn't know how to like keep herself tied to reality. On page 636, there's a plot point. "But the monster is not incapable of love. This was the horror of my father, little Lisey. He loved his boys." And So this is at this point a section where Scott had written to Lisey, and he called it Lisey's story that she found in Booyah Moon for the last time. And this short section just kind of proves that Scott didn't blame his father for acting this way, for killing his brother, for threatening his life, but that it really was this long boy. It was this madness that was overtaking him, and that he himself was perfectly fine, that he was very loving and caring. And you've seen this in a few other instances throughout the story, but Scott kind of shows that he forgives his father for everything that he's done to him. And you could also tell that at this point it's kind of his like last will and last will and testament, that this note is kind of just explaining that like he forgives people and that he's moving on from these things that probably have been bothering him his entire life. On page 639, another plot point is down, and he has dozed in and out of half a dozen strange and sometimes lovely dreams, at least one of which will later become the basis of a novel, long enough for him to name that wonderful shelter the Story Tree. So that's finally when you realize in his letter that he's found this tree in Booyah Moon, and that's where he's come up with all of these novels. That he's finally just put down on paper that this is what happened. That you don't just speculate that he came up with these ideas in this imagination world, that he actually did come up with them, and that they really did come to him when he was in this imagination world. That it was a safe place for him. That he even called this tree the Story Tree, and that this is probably where he came back to. That it wasn't just the pool, it wasn't just the fairy forest, it was this tree specifically. On page 646, I have another plot point. I brought it down. Like Lisey, I brought it down in love, I swear, and I killed my father. I thought I might have hit him with it again, but that single blow was enough, and all my life it's been on my mind. All my life it's been the thought inside every thought. I get up thinking I killed my father and go to bed thinking it. So this is kind of just, again, proving that he killed his father. That we had seen this much earlier on in the story, that he told her that he killed him with a pickaxe. But this is finally when he actually admits to the fact that he killed his father, and that he's really sad and upset about it. Not because he didn't think that it was the right choice, but that he had to make that choice. He didn't feel like he deserved to have made that choice. That he shouldn't have made that choice, but he had to, because at this point his father gave him no other choice, and it was the only way for him to actually be able to survive. And again, you kind of see this sense of him admitting, these faults in his life, and he's kind of trying to like just let go of this baggage before he dies, and also to give Lisey an understanding of why he did the things he did and why these actions happened. And then the final point that I have is on page 651. It is a plot point. Use the African, Scott had written, and had told her she knew how to get it back, not to Booyah Moon, but to this world. And of course she did. So this is the final point where she kind of realizes how she's able to keep herself from kind of going back and forth between reality and this imagination world, and that it's the African, it's the Afghan that her mother had sewn for them. And it's been shown kind of as this important symbol, important item throughout the story, but now she realizes that all she has to do is soak this African into the pool, and that it's going to be her anchor. It's going to be the way that she's going to be able to keep herself not only in reality, but to keep the long boy out of reality. It's a bit kind of keep her safe. And that if she ever did want to go back to the Booyah Moon, she could just wrap the African around herself, and that it would be the anchor to bring her back as well. But she kind of realized that like once she's able to use the African to get back, she doesn't want anything to do with Booyah Moon, that she is finally free from all of the confusion and issues that she's had with that reality, with Scott's past. Okay, so those are all of my thoughts from the story of Lisey's Story by Stephen King. I hope that you found all my thoughts interesting. I hope that you have also read along and kind of experienced the same things that I thought. If you have any other thoughts or comments about the story, about what I've said, or just about anything in general, please leave them down in the comments. I'll be leaving my thoughts on the actual TV show from Apple TV at some point in the future, and I'll make the comparisons from what I've talked about in the book to what I've seen in the show as well. But thank you so much for listening to this video. I hope you really liked it. Please like it if you did, and subscribe if you haven't already to my channel, and I'll meet you in the next recording. Bye.